Welcome to the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name is David Wheatley. We're here to talk leadership in small, bite-sized and practical chunks. Enjoy.
Well, welcome to this episode of the Humanergy Leadership Podcast, and I am joined once again by my two colleagues in conversation, Judy Brown and Rick Eigenbrod. And we've previously talked about what happens when you get what you want, based a little bit around Rick's book. And as we reflect on a graduation speech that Rick actually never gave, and more about that at the end, the thought crossed our minds as to what the meaning of graduation is and what else we should be graduating from. Is it really about identifying what we should let go of and what we need to embrace to continue to move forward and grow? So, building on what happens when you get what you want, what should we be graduating from? And where does this lead us?
Wow. And where does this conversation lead us? So, this idea of a graduation speech that Rick never gave came into my hands this way. I was wandering around on the internet and I think I Googled Rick's website to see something or other. And instead, I got this long speech that said at the top of it, the graduation speech I never gave. And to further confuse me, it was wrapped in what looked like Arabic all around it was like framed in Arabic. And I thought, well, this is wild. And then I started reading it and I realized that what he had to say was really profound and it was touching me. So that caused me to call him and go, what's the deal with this? So, Rick, let me turn this over to you for a moment and let's see where we go with this.
Yeah, exactly. Well, just a small but maybe important kind of correction, if you will forgive the phrase. Judy found this somewhere. Wasn't on my website. It was out there in the universe somewhere, and it was on the Facebook page of a colleague. And when Judy sent it to me, I have to confess, I hardly remembered writing it. It was a long time ago. I don't remember sending it to my colleague. I have no idea how he got it. So we're wrapped in a mystery before we even get started. And I went back and read it and I said, well, first off, it's very long. So I tried, for our purposes, I tried to boil it down. And I'd like to read you the very abridged version of the graduation speech I never gave. And it goes like this. You did it. You gave them what they wanted. You got what you came for. Sometimes you did it cum laude, sometimes come hella high water. But now it's time to move on. You know it, they know it. So now what? Commencement. A celebration, a recognition of what has ended, and an acceptance of what no longer is. Mm-hmm. So now what? Commencement, a time to begin. You may commence.
Which, of course, just calls the question for all of us. What season? I was thinking how nature does this kind of ceremony all the time. I mean, it drops its leaves in the fall. We go, it's the end of the autumn. Here comes the winter. Snow comes down, at least where David and I are. And it marks another transition. But in our lives, sometimes those transitions are not so clear. And the graduation and the commencement feels more like a case of the flu in some cases than it does a major movement in our lives. So this matter of what would happen if we took a breath ever so often and ask ourselves, what kind of turning point are we approaching or in, and what does it suggest or leave completely ambiguous and terrifying about what's ahead, and how do we mark those kinds of turning points in a way that gives us greater centeredness and greater comfort's not the right word, but ease with the uncertainty that's ahead, that's unfolding for us. And
So-
David, I said, whoops, go ahead.
No, well, I was just going to say, because I've had 2 clients in the last 2 weeks where this has kind of come up without this conversation. And it's been a matter of, hey, I think I've done what I can here and I'm ready for the next adventure. And then the question came is, could we have that adventure within the current organization, or was that somewhere else? And with one of the clients, it turns out, as you look at the pattern, they were on about a 5-year cycle that of excitement in a new role, of solidifying it, working out how it all worked, and then getting to a place where they were a little bit bored and ready to move on to the next thing, which I think is interesting when you look at graduation. Normally is around a 4-year cycle in this country. That how many people are on that same kind of cycle. And I think the same challenge is how many people then don't do anything about it, but fall into that what's the life of mediocrity. Who was it said that?
Yeah. One of the things that this conversation brought up for me, and going back and reading what I'd written, is that there were just layers that began to kind of reveal themselves to me. Certainly the first thing, and what I wrote was how inimicably connected beginnings and endings are. So the graduation ceremony itself, which we think of as an ending ceremony, really is called commencement. So it's beginning, and rituals call our attention to what's ending and what's beginning. And sometimes we have separate rituals for that. And I also thought, wait a minute, at that graduation ceremony, this notion of beginnings and endings wasn't just true for the students, it was true for everyone in attendance. It was true for the faculty, it was true for the parents, it was true for anybody connected to this institution and its seasons. And how inimicably tied beginnings and endings are, and how rituals sort of in some way make that visible, that that's going on. And as you said, I've noticed as well as you have, is that sometimes we don't want to recognize its ending. Right. And we have no rituals for that. This cheeky question came to my mind. When do you know a marriage is ended?
It's a good question. I left the pause there for a flippant answer that I didn't come up with. But you're really, apart from that question, you're getting to 2 points in my mind there, Rick. One of them is what are the starting and end points that we need to be graduating in our lives, whether they be at work on a regular basis. And then the second thing is, what are the rituals that we could instill that would make that transition easier?
Yeah, I think Judy and I talked a little bit about that. And so, part of, I think our conversations we've said is there just this fertile ground for emergence. And I'm just struck by what's emerged, some of which comes from inside of me, some of which sometimes comes from outside. So just as Judy and I are talking about graduation and beginnings and endings, I get this note from my old Jesuit high school in New Orleans, which is 3 minutes on how they bring in freshmen, which wasn't when I was there. And I called a colleague who had been a faculty member at St. Albans, which is near you, Judy, and said, do you have this kind of beginning ceremony there? And he said, yeah, we do. We have each freshman, we have a service in the chapel, and each freshman is walked down the aisle by 2 seniors. Wow. And that beginning ceremony, is so important. And thinking about ceremonies, and because endings and beginnings are so tied together. And Judy, I think you were talking about an ending ceremony that one of your clients in businesses did,
right.
and the whole notion that beginnings happen with ending well.
Yes.
So one of the questions I will ask people in the kind of situation that you're talking about, David, is if you're ending, the first question is, what constitutes ending well?
Right.
And this, Judy's, your example, I thought was beautiful.
Yeah, I was working with a group of corporate folks on change, and one of the guys said, change is really tough. He said, I know that firsthand. And so I perked right up to see what he had to say. And he said he was with a very large US corporation, and they had decided, and everybody agreed, to close what they called the buggy whip business that no longer had any following. David and I are familiar with this. We were involved in closing a Ford plant way back when together.
It used to make buggies, I think.
Probably. And so so he said, this guy said, and he said, we'd done everything right by the book. Everybody had a good job. They were being paid at least what they were before. There were no arguments that we needed to close this place down. And he said, we were just miserable. We were in a funk. Everybody was in a bad mood about this. And he said, this is the quote of the day, I did the only thing a thinking engineer could do. And I said, and what would that be? And he said, I reserved the corporate headquarters for a month out, and I sent an invitation to everybody who'd ever been part of the buggy whip business and told them that they were to assemble at the given time, large numbers of people. I hired a choir, a church choir, and I got enormous amounts of good food. And I had all of this brought into the beautiful atrium of corporate headquarters. And he said, I got a casket, and I put it right in the middle of corporate headquarters. And on the day we all assembled, and he said, we talked about people who'd ever been part of this, people who were alive, people who had passed on. We told stories, we laughed, we cried, we sang, the choir sang, we sang with the choir, we ate the food, it was fabulous, he said, and at the end of the day, we buried that sucker and got on with it. And that was the end of his story. I think of that so often, the genius of it, but how many times do we, either as an individual in terms of our own life, find a way to do a ritual, or particularly when we're leaders, name a spot that we're in and create a ritual for wrapping up what has been and aiming us toward what is yet to be. That's a leadership responsibility, and it's almost never in the job description. Somehow this guy with the casket got the idea.
And I love that story, because it's here's a transition, and many of us are going on in different directions, and here's a ritual that helps us address that transition, yes, and move in our separate directions. Yes. And I often wonder, I do some work with credit unions and merging, and when they merge, my encouragement is always the new company is a different company to either of the previous two. Yep. And yet we don't necessarily always do a great job of ending the previous ones and beginning the new one, which is somewhat what you're alluding to, Rick, is let's celebrate that. Let's make a marker in the sand.
Yep. They're so tied together. And I think we either put our focus on one or the other, depending on the circumstance. Judy, my personal example of that in business is we sold ourselves back to corporate. I'll spare you the details. And I was bemoaning the fact that it was so different. And I called a friend of mine who I bemoaned to, and he just listened, and he went, Rick, get this. The old gang doesn't meet here anymore. And it's like, oh, okay, I got it. I want to add one more consideration to this very rich area of inquiry we have and of observation. And we talk about beginnings and endings, but those are inimicably tied, again, with gains and losses, right? Beginning and endings come with gains and losses. And I think that one of the things, when I think back, to tie into what David said about the work I'd done with executives, business people, particularly it began with who sold their businesses, and like old Yeller died, realized through this speech that was the thing that opened my mind to this is going on everywhere. Yeah. The dynamic that goes on with them is going on in the college graduates. So you two come from academia. I come from academia. You from the academic side, me from student affairs. So let me ask you, what do you think was the major task that the students who came, what is the major task that they engaged in that we recognize with graduation?
Wow.
Stump the stars.
Right.
Well, firstly, I'd like to say I tend to distance myself from academia any chance I get, but I appreciate your connection to it. And and secondly, yeah, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because on one hand, you've got, hey, you just did the time, you've finished something, so you've completed you've attained this award, and then you could go to a higher level and say in this country in particular, you've transitioned from being a kid at home to being an adult that you're now expected to not necessarily move straight back in with mum and dad, although many of them seem to be doing at the moment.
Right.
And they have trouble. By the way, David, that's a fabulous answer. So I really applaud that deeper look at what's going on. That, in a sense, I think one of the things I'd propose is, yes, they come there to do all the things we want them to do so that they can get a degree. And there is completion, if you will, when they do all those things, right? Tick off the boxes. As my daughter said, I gave them everything they wanted and they threw me out of the best 4 years of my life. But if we really look a bit deeper, that what David said is really the task, and what's beginning and ending from a psychologist, forgive me, point of view, is the stage of development. This stage from late adolescence, welcome freshman, to early adulthood. And while we're teaching them physics and English and all that stuff, they are going through the messy bits of transitioning from late adolescence to early adulthood. And basically we tell the parents, look, you don't want to look at the sausage making factory. We'll take care of them. Go away and let us do our jobs, as the chancellor at Rollins said to the parents on the last day of orientation. Go home and let us do our jobs, which is to take to steward your student not just into the world of work and what's to come, but to steward your child through late adolescence into early adulthood. And I realized that has implication for everybody in the audience.
Well, and if, lately I've been working with William Bridges' work on transitions. A man by the name of Bridges writing on transitions should not be allowed, but he helps us see that that the ending is often quite a while in the making, and that we think we're arriving at a new shore, but all the new thing, whatever it is yet to be discovered, always begins with an ending. And then there's the sausage making in between, which he calls the neutral zone, which is like 40 years in the wilderness, because it's unknown territory. And yet it's got huge potential for creativity and development if we can keep, I was going to say from having a panic attack, but I think I'd say, when I think of my own life, snapping back into an old pattern or an old role or an old job. And because of the discomfort of finding yourself, you've left the shore and you can't get back there. And the future is this sort of ambiguous horizon that you're paddling toward gracelessly. And you just want the comfort of certainty, and there's none in this. There just isn't.
No.
And the strength of character that it takes to keep moving ahead and keep walking and keep uncovering and keep discovering and making mistakes and picking yourself up and so forth. That's the stuff of making great leaders, but you have to go through all that.
Judy, I remember one of the people I was working with who had sold his company and was really having a tough time of it. And this is a cliche in American life and American business, et cetera, but it's real for the people who go through it, and they don't get a lot of sympathy. Let me see, you just got $35 million and you're whining about it? Come on. He said to me, I feel so unmoored. And I, in a moment of brilliance, said, and now you can sail.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, and now we can sail. But it really is scary. I'm struck by the importance of rituals as a public recognition of what may go on under the surface that's invisible. And that in some way, because it's a challenge, we keep it invisible to ourselves. We don't want to know what we know. And what we offer each other when we have these conversations, or we are forced by circumstances to acknowledge what is and what's lost and what will be gained. And endings and beginnings are absolutely tied to loss and gain. There's I think I mentioned I grew up in New Orleans, and in traditionally it was mostly in a Black community there, and we've seen this. There was a ritual that I think is fabulous, that if you grew up Catholic in New Orleans, and almost everybody does, you have a traditional thing called the wake, then a mass the next day, and you go to the cemetery, you bury them, and everybody sort of wanders off. And I was just talking to my sister, and she said, we don't call it wake anymore. We call it visitation. So the ritual is to visit with the dead person and to visit with each other, which makes a lot of sense. But historically, and again, it was not widespread in the Black community. There would be the march to the cemetery, and we've seen this, right? And it's very dirgy music. The person is put in the ground, you turn around, and all of a sudden the music is upbeat, second line, everybody dancing, right? That's an ending. This is a beginning. The ritual marking of that boundary is so important. And where do we have those? Where can we construct those when we don't?
It's interesting as I'm listening to you there, Rick, because I mean, we're talking about big rituals here, and I think one of the things I've tried to do with the podcast is bring things to a practical level. And I was talking with a client recently that is it's a city government administration, and one of the things that they were talking about was that they'd had turnover in their public works department. And one of the things in their feedback was, you don't even buy us our own Carhartts. And Carhartts being those thick overalls that they wear in the winter here in Michigan to do all the work. And the question was, well, why don't we? And the response was, well, what if they leave? And then the city manager was saying, well, let's turn this into something. And when you show up day one, you get presented with your own Carhartts. In some ways, that's a ritual that you're talking about. That's a simple onboarding that just is exciting, that makes you feel welcome. And my guess is they're going to see a reduction in turnover just because of that sense of welcoming and onboarding. And I read some data about a year ago that talked about onboarding, that if you just do your normal onboarding, you get a certain level of turnover. If you do an onboarding where you spend some time with people and then you give them a jacket, then you get a slightly less turnover. But if you do your onboarding and then spend time with people really getting to know individuals, and then you gave them a company jacket with their name embroidered on it, those people hardly ever left.
Right.
And I'm just thinking, on a most simple level, that's a ritual of onboarding. So it's not a matter of we have to have the casket in the corporate headquarters. It's just, are we doing the right way of getting people on board? And then at the other end, I've got a number of clients that are approaching retirement. And we tend to do this retirement party, but then that's about it. And sometimes people don't want it. Are we doing a good job of those rituals?
Right.
Yes.
And then there's a gazillion rituals in between. What do we do when the person gets their first leadership job? What do we do when they get their C-suite job? What do they do when they get their first leader of leaders job?
Exactly.
Are we separating from the past, and are we engaging in the future?
Well, and
Judy,
David,
I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
yeah. Are you willing to talk about the ritual that you use in your business at the turn of the year, the first of the year? Because for me, it represents just what we're talking about in well, go ahead and tell what you did, because you mentioned this last time we talked. I was so struck with it. You're on.
Well, and it's actually kind of a small one, and again, it's practical. But we run on a calendar year. We're a small business, and at the end of the year, we have had for 22 years a holiday party, and we just go around the room and say, what's been the exciting thing about this last year? What's the fun thing you're looking forward to in the next year? And then as an organization, the two owners, we transition ownership. So that, not ownership, the mantle. So I get to be the president in the odd years and John's the president in the even years. So there's a symbolic handing over of the baton. And what comes with that is you get to pick the word of the year. And so we review the word of the previous year and we pick a word for the forthcoming year. And this has become a ritual that's built into our metrics, but it again feels a little bit like what you're talking about there, Rick, is we cast off the last year and we prepare ourselves for the next year. And it's just in that moment that happens.
Yeah.
Listen to the language about cast off and unmoored. Back to that. Rick, you're on, sorry.
No. It's great. I love it. This is like if we were sitting around the table talking, which we are.
Yeah.
I was thinking
I
about
have to say though, if any of my former naval colleagues in the past that are listening to this would critique me for saying cast off, because only fishermen and knitters cast off, seamen let go. So I would be in trouble for that.
Well, even better, David, because this whole thing about beginnings and endings is tied to letting go and taking on. Yes. Right? And we usually focus on one or the other. I was thinking about a company I work for. Think about when you go public and when companies go public, right? What's the ceremony that says we did it, we went public? They go to Wall Street and they ring the bell, right? And so this total focus on the sort of gain, if you will, of going public. Mm-hmm. And yet everybody who works for that company knows there is real loss here. There is beginnings as a public company, which is enormously different from what we were before in terms of identity, sense of meaning, and structure. The three things that are going on and challenging graduates, people who sell their businesses, athletes who finish the Olympics. It's the same thing. It's like that beginnings and endings are so connected to gains and losses. And I think that's a part of the reason we need the rituals to help us kind of deal with that, integrate it, recognize it.
Right. Well, the other thing about this that I've been surprised by is this notion that the day of graduation is the commencement. That's the day it's happened. But this notion that there is an undercurrent of emotions, period, that lead up to that because people know it's coming, and that go out from that, and it's an emotional dynamic. Yes, there's the fact of the graduation. Yes, there's the fact of the birth of the baby, but there's an undercurrent of emotion, and it has its own pace. There's no shoving it, pushing it, pretending it's not there, denying it, wanting to get to whatever is new faster, wanting whatever is new to be better or clear. It just doesn't work like that. And so there's such a feeling of not doing life right or being lost somehow because we find ourselves in these swamps. My friend Michael Jones said to me one day, if you call it a wetland, would you feel better about it?
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And, we've talked in our conversations together quite a lot about Rick's pilgrimage and my sailing trip and the start and the finish of that. And as I was listening to Rick and you, Judy, share there again, unbeknownst to us, we stopped just before we left BVI and said, okay, let's just stop, pause, take a picture. This is a letting go. And then when we arrived in the Azores, which was the first land we'd seen for a couple of weeks at one point, we pulled into the Azores, and everybody in the the harbor there knew exactly where you'd been for the last 2 weeks, because that's the only reason you were stopping off in that particular island was because you just crossed the Atlantic. And we pulled into our bay, and the boat next to us immediately handed us a bottle of whiskey for us all to have a drink. And it was, nothing planned. It was nothing there, but they knew what we just experienced and wanted to make sure that there was some celebration of that. And we were only there for 6 or 7 hours, and we were gone again to head north. But I thought those two, the fact that we paused to take a picture to say, okay, we're leaving what we know. And then the moment we pull in somewhere else, and somebody wants to say, stop a minute, just take a dram, because you've just achieved something that most people don't achieve. That kind of gets to this. It doesn't have to be that elaborate. It just has to be that marking of the departure and the recognition and the marking of the next step.
It has to be public in some way, so that we are seen and it's seen and others see it. I think that public, one of the things I was struck by in our conversations is we tend to treat these situations of beginnings and endings sometimes as though they are events to overcome, challenges to get through, or if I can survive this. And yet, if you take a longer look in terms of time, this is a part of life. This is cyclical. This will happen over and over. That's the good news, because we will come out the other end different and better than we were before. And if you really zoom out, what I was reminded of is Joseph Campbell's work on A Hero with 1,000 Faces, The Hero's Journey. It has 3 pieces: separation, initiation, you go out and you face the demons, whatever they are, and you win a boon and return. That is, you bring back the fire, the golden fleece, more me,
Right.
to where you started. And we do that over and over again. And it's not something to be survived. It's something to be lived through. And I think if we have a larger sense about it, it will help us do that.
It's reminded me as well, my one dipping my toe into academia, I kick off Michigan State University's executive MBA program, and have done for the last 25 years. And one of the rituals they start there is they get them to write a letter to their future self about why they're entering into this program. I think it's a great idea. We've seen that from elementary school to wherever. And then I get to be there at the halfway through in the beginning of their second year when they get those letters back. And a number of people, when they were writing it, said, I'm going to go write this on my own because I think I'm going to get emotional. And when I saw them being handed back this last weekend, when I was there for the second year, a number of people said, I'm going to go read this on my own. And so to your point about it being public, there's a public element to that, but it's really acknowledging something that then goes private and gets people to experience their growth and their journey.
Yes.
It's both, David, and I think that's a theme for our conversation today. These things come together. It's very personal, and yet in some way it's public. It goes on inside of us, but because it does, it's going to be reflected outside of us. It comes with gain and it comes with loss. It comes with beginnings and it comes with endings. It's, this notion about how intertwined these things are, and they're all going on at graduation.
Right.
So just since we got the psychologist and the poet in the room, and we'll value both sides of that thinking, what about those times when the person doesn't want that recognition? Just let me slip slowly away into retirement. I hear that all the time. I don't need to be recognized. I don't need to have that. What do we do with that situation?
I wonder what would happen if we could just ask the question of what would make this a really good finish for you, a good ending. And how might you contribute to that, and how might we contribute to it? Those are the questions that come to mind. I think there is, even for people who just want to, and sometimes it's because the situation has been miserable recently. It's just not been pretty. But I think there is a wish in all of us to want to finish well. And I think to open a door to people who look like they're turning that aside is a kind thing to do.
Which I love that perspective, because I quite often work with people in the last 5 years, and the word I always bring up is legacy. What's your legacy going to be, and how do you spend the last 5 years creating that legacy in the hope that people want to then look back at that? Rick?
I was going to ask you what your thoughts are. If I have a couple of thoughts for our consideration. If identity is how I am known to self and others, then I think one of the big pieces here is how will I be known to myself and others if I take on this label of retired? So one is, I think we got to get rid of the label. Judy, you spoke to this a bit, right?
Yep.
The language itself is really a problem. So how do I, in a sense, take where I am and refresh, renew, refine my sense of self? And I sometimes will give people this little exercise because it gets them current with themselves, and it acknowledges what's not there, and it begins to give them a look at what forward. I ask them to make 2 T charts. You know those T charts we used to make like that? And on one, I asked them to label what used to be that no longer is. On the other one, what's now true that didn't used to be true.
Mm-hmm.
And I ask them to do those 2 T charts. On one side, what are the simple facts? And then what are the meaning of the facts? And what that does is it invites them into the very process they need to go through right now, which is the process of integration and differentiation. One of those is differentiation, right? It used to be, and now it's not. I no longer am. That's a refinement of that. The other one is integration. I didn't used to be, and it didn't used to be, and now it is. And I think it gives them a kind of grounding around the sense about my sense of self, what matters, what fits, and it's a, in a sense, it's a personal but public acknowledgement.
Yes.
Of what's lost and what's gained. And they have a sense about and see themselves in this much more broad way. And certainly one of the things that I ask them to do is find another word for other than retirement.
I have a colleague who is, I think at the end of this month, retiring from what he characterizes his 40-year desk job. He's been leading one or another institution during all that time. And people keep saying to him, so you know the question, so what are you doing next?
Oh,
and,
yeah.
Yeah. And he says, I'm walking. They say, what? He says, I'm walking. Every day I'm walking. That's what I'm doing next. And and he has just stripped retirement out of everybody's vocabulary with a very simple statement. 1 foot ahead of the other. Thank you. I'm walking.
And we've talked about that major shift from graduating college to doing something else. For those that do, we're talking about the other end of the career into that retirement zone. But I think that simple exercise that you just shared, Rick, that works everywhere along the way. I mean, if you get promoted to be the team leader, you could ask that same question just to help you clarify what's different and what is no more, and what will be as you move forward. And I love that simple exercise to do that as a recognition of that transition.
What happens, David, is it's a recognition, an acknowledgement of what wasn't, what's lost, right? And it begins to give glimmers of what could be. They discover things like, oh, there's some vitality when I talk about this. And now we have something to go on, not a plan, not a goal, not a what are you going to do. It's not a destination, as we've talked about. It's a direction. Follow the energy.
Right.
Yeah. So whatever I'm doing, if I'm just changing teams, I could do that same exercise.
That's right.
And draw the same energy from it.
Yeah, of course. And if you do it publicly like that in a group, it's a ritual, right? It is that ritual. So yeah, thank you. I do think there are many uses for it. Why might it have universality? Because it's basically a way to engage differentiation and integration, which is the dynamic process of human development, which will go on over the course of our lives forever.
Right.
And that's another 40 minutes we've spent chatting with each other on this on another subject. So I appreciate the wisdom once more. I thought that was a good spot to leave it off, because it's not about graduation. It's about all the transitions that we go through. I know we're recognizing them. I know we're taking time to have a ritual around them somewhere along the line.
Yes.
And I'm going to post this in all the normal places. But if you have a ritual as you're listening to this that you think fits in with what we've been talking about, please go to the Humanergy YouTube site and you'll see this episode posted. And I'd love to see some notes on there about what other people's rituals are, and build this conversation. So once again, Rick, thank you for your wisdom. Judy, thank you for your wisdom too. And I'm sure we will gather together soon.
Looking forward.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, David.
So I hope you're now thinking about what rituals do you need to be holding for what graduations in your world. And please feel free to pop to Humanergy's YouTube site. On the back of episode 85, you'll be able to make a comment and some recommendations as to your graduations and rituals that you've found in the past or in the future have worked for you. And as we finished, Judy recognized a poem that she wanted to share. So if you're not into poetry, now's the time to turn off. But remember to go like and subscribe. If you do enjoy a little bit of a poem that brings clarity to what we've just been talking about, here's Judy. And that's the end of this episode.
So this is a poem by Lucille Clifton, who was the poet laureate at the state of Maryland, which is where I'm reading this from, the state of Maryland. She wrote it south of here in St. Mary's, and it's called Blessing the Boats. May the tide that is entering even now the lip of our understanding carry you out beyond the face of fear. May you kiss the wind, then turn from it, certain that it will love your back. May you open your eyes to water, water, waving forever. And may you, in your innocence, sail through this to that.
That was the Humanergy Leadership Podcast. My name's David Wheatley. For further information about Humanergy, go to humanergy.com or check out our latest book, What Great Teams Do Great, from all good bookstores. Have a good one. Stay healthy.